Hi, welcome to the Canadian City and Southern Model Railroad. Today's video is about carving some styrofoam, some different techniques than I've shown before, and some misadventures with static grass. The rest of the styrofoam scenery is in place for the whole rest of the railroad, and the background areas, which were done when the layout was apart and turned around, have had their plaster paint bedrock applied and their carving is done. The foreground still needs to be carved. As I pan around towards the future site of Wolf, you can see how I've used stair-stepping, angled stair-stepping, sheet foam, and cookie cuttering down and up to make the various rock forms. It's now ready for carving in the foreground. This area in here will be granite and not sandstone. A few of the buildings have been set in their approximate locations. I'll have to dig into the hillside to mount them permanently. The wiring for the lighting for Wolf has been installed and the wires are sticking up through the layout and taped so that they won't get lost. That way I don't have to reach underneath when the lighting is completed in the structures, and they can be plugged in to be removed for detailing, etc. The styrofoam has now all been glued in place. Most of the carving is also done as well. In here, the strata of the sandstone, I've made it quite steep. That's because that's where the sandstone ends. Now I'm getting into the granite. You've seen how I carve my stratified rock, but this is going to have to be different. Plus, there's some restrictions that I'm going to have to deal with based on the fact that behind all of this and below this is my standard gauge tunnel that will serve basically as a staging track for standard gauge trains. So it's only a ½ inch down to the top of the track, to the clearance to the track, and only a ½ inch in. So I don't have a lot of room to carve in here. Plus the carving techniques have got to represent granite and not sandstone. So I'm going to show a little of that because it's different from what I've shown in previous videos. So the first thing I need to do is on the top, and remember I can't come down more than a ½ inch or I'll have a hole in my scenery. But what little bit of depth I do have here, I'm going to reduce it in places. this will break up the straight line edge and make it look a little more natural. That's about as far as I can go in that area without going through. The top of the styrofoam tunnel has been rasped down as much as I dare without going all the way through the 1/2-inch foam. On top, I've glued a few little pieces of scrap foam to represent outcroppings and to break up the flatness of the fact that it's really a top of a tunnel. On the face, the cliff face, I put a few little pieces of foam to kind of break up that straight line as well. In here, I've already started to carve some of those. The carving is somewhat random, and I'll show that in a minute. Over in this area, I've put a few vertical bits instead of sort of random. And they will be carved similar so that it all blends together, but so that it's not exactly identical. So there's some change through the area. By bringing the stream bed of the Canadian River back behind the track for a short distance, I will further exaggerate the fact that the dual gauge and the standard gauge that's hidden in the tunnel are actually far, far away, even though they're almost right next to each other. Now it's time to start doing some carving. I'll do this with my little keyhole saw. Could also use an X-Acto, but this is a little rougher and faster for this type of a rock formation. Instead of going all parallel or nearly horizontal like I did in my sandstone, I'm going to go nearly vertical but not quite and cut fairly hard and not right close together like I was cutting strata. Again, when I get towards the top, I gotta be careful not to go through this edge and make a hole. Already did that here and I had to plug it. Now I'm going to come back across in another direction. Again, not quite vertical and definitely not horizontal. And again, I'm not doing near as many cuts as I would if I was doing stratified rock. Goes pretty quickly. Now I'm going to start peeling away some of it. Along this straight line, because I have 2 layers of foam here, this is now a full inch thick and gives me a little bit more room to carve, and I can come down and break up this straight line a little bit. The look I'm after is kind of like as if I'd used rock mold castings. but that would add a lot of weight and add different materials that I have to store and maintain. So I'm just going to go ahead and carve the foam. In this area where I've put a few pieces of foam to increase the thickness of the cliff face, the difference between the pieces of foam and the background piece of foam, backing piece of foam, is too obvious. So I'm going to have to do a little more work along the edges of the pieces that I glued on the face. And the backing piece of foam. Again, I can't go more than 1/4 inch or so in here, but I'll add some parallel lines. And then some lines coming in a more vertical direction. And now I'll just kind of, from every which way, pick at the edges and try to blend it all together better. That will get covered with a warm gray layer of plaster paint, as opposed to the raw sienna plaster paint that will be applied to the last little bit of sandstone on the layout. In this area in here, I've put a few vertical pieces rather than the more random shaped pieces. And so over here I'll be cutting more vertical on my main cuts, and then coming back and my secondary cuts at an angle. Right here, the seam between the top and the side separated as I was carving over in here. So I've had to force some adhesive in there, and now I'll have to let this dry for at least 24 hours before I can carve this last little bit. In this area, I've cookie cuttered the slope down. But instead of using individual pieces, this was all one piece of styrofoam, 1/2 inch thick. I cut all of these in an angle and then glued the layers together. So this was originally one piece. Now the result is that right here where the seams are, it's very thin. So I could simply take these top edges where I have room to do a little shaping and smooth that down into a hillside. But I think I will do a little carving in here just to blend it into the rest of the area that's more of a cliff face. Now I have to be very careful not to cut into the bottoms. So I'm just going to cut at the tops. Got a little more room where there's a little more flat space on the top. I'm doing this more gently than I've done other places. Now I'll come back across from another direction. And again, I'm not doing this as much as if it was strata rock. Now I'll come back over with the rasp, not too heavy, and just take off these edges. There's one final step that I'll need to do everywhere that there's the pink foam exposed before I put on the plaster paints. And that is to come over the entire surface with a plastic bristle brush, every direction. This will improve the appearance overall on the entire thing slightly. But mostly what it's doing is removing all of the little bits of styrofoam that either didn't quite cut off or have stuck with static electricity and could get in the plaster and mess it up so that it doesn't go on smoothly. And I'll need to go on and do this every place. All of the styrofoam is now completely covered, and the final carving has gone into the rock strata on the sandstone. But what I'd like to point out here is that there's one more step that I've done that I didn't bother with on the rest of the layout so far, and that is I've added dirt and gravel. Now that was made by crushing up excess from when I put on the plaster paint mix over top of the styrofoam. I lay it out on thin sheets of plastic and let it dry. Here are the colors that I use to make gravel, rocks, dirt for my layout. Now this is a combination of paint and plaster like I've put over top of the styrofoam on the layout. Burnt umber, raw umber, burnt sienna mixed with red oxide, raw sienna, the color I use the most on the layout, and yellow ochre. Now, as you can see, I'm out of some of these finer grits, but I made this by spreading my plaster goop out on a thin piece of plastic, like a garbage bag or a grocery bag or something like that, and letting it dry. Then I break it up into thin sheets, break it up some more, and sift it through two different sizes of sifters, regular old kitchen sifters. And in the end, I can end up with a fine powder. This can then be sifted right on the layout. I'm out of the raw sienna powder because it's the one I use the most, because it's my base color for most of the layout. The same thing with the burnt umber, because it makes a very good topsoil color. The other three are more highlight colors. The two darker ones require a lot more pigment mixed in with the plaster. Otherwise, they just turn out a light gray. However, when they get damp or wet, they become very dark. And I've noticed the same thing happens with certain types of topsoil in nature. Now let's see what happens when I apply a little bit of wet water to help hold all of this in place. See how much darker the darker colors got when damp, as opposed to the raw sienna and yellow ochre. Over on this part of the layout, the carving is all done, and it's been covered with a layer of plaster, and in that has been mixed a warm gray. And this was made by mixing a little bit of burnt umber with some black. Now I have to be very careful, and I've had to do some of this over again, because gauging the color of this when it's wet is very difficult. It takes a little bit of practice and sometimes a little bit of reworking. So over here on the granite, some of this has had two coats and some of it hasn't, but it's all had a warm gray wash when it was done. And you can see just how much darker it gets when it's damp. It'll have several consecutive layers of various colors of soil depending on the location. More of the lighter, warmer colors on flatter areas, and more of the topsoil color on the cliff faces, as well as some burnt color, red oxide and burnt umber. I ran short of static grass. I had quite a bit of Woodland Scenics light green. I've had it for a very long time, and over time, in the bottle, in the dark, it's turned kind of a grayish color, which when I tried a little bit in the test was not going to work for me. So what I did was I went to the fabric store and I got some dye and some dye remover. And I soaked a fair amount of it in dye remover. Now I did a little test first and it came out kind of a pinky color. Then I did a bigger batch and it came out purple, especially when it was wet. After drying, it came out to this kind of light pinkish gray color. So I bleached it. And after I bleached it, the same material came out this yellow-orange color. So I now have a fair bit of these two colors left. Then I tried to dye some of this, and it worked pretty well. But I've still had a bit of a misadventure because even in 100-degree direct sunlight, it's taken a long time for this stuff to dry, and then it had to be sifted so it wouldn't be clumped up. The same with this. The same thing after I dyed it. So I went to the store and got these bags for straining jelly, making jellies and jams. And I put some of the damp material in here and threw it in the dryer. Well, that worked on the first try, but on a slightly bigger batch with both bags sort of full, one of the bags came open in the dryer and the static grass got everywhere. I was able to salvage a little bit of it, but I had to vacuum and wipe out my dryer. So I'll probably dry it in the sun from now on, even though it takes several days. Here I've got Woodland Scenics medium green. And this is the orangey stuff, dyed with about equal amounts of yellow and green dye. This is with a little more yellow mixed with the green dye. And this is just the green dye, not mixed as thick. Now all of these also had a fixative after the dye had sat in the solution for a while. And the dye I used was specially formulated for nylon and rayon and so on. And it's a few cents more expensive per bottle than the regular dye. Here in the area of Wolf, two light dustings of various types of the dirt I've made have been put down, with the 5 colors I showed. Mostly it's the raw sienna, and the burnt umber. Now this is now dry, and it'll get darker again when I get wet. But I'll go ahead and get it wet when I put the glue down and add the static grass once I have enough. Well, thanks for watching. Have a great day, and we'll see you next time.